Welcome to the second part of our heritage talk on the Berlin Airlift 10 tons for Tempelhof, exploring the Marshall Plan.
So we have an interesting situation by 1946, 1947, and that is that Germany and Europe is slowly starting to rebuild itself. It is still partitioned and not totally locked within that partitioning. So Germany is split into zones. Great swathes of Central Europe are now under the jurisdiction of one dictator who had replaced the previous dictator. Some of those countries did not become free, if that's the right word for that, until 1991, 1992. So we have the start of the East and West bloc, if you like. Now, President Truman in America was alarmed by communism and its apparent spread, and it wasn't long before it was realized that communism had the potential to take most of Europe. Everywhere had suffered at the heel of an uber right-wing government. Well, government, or what's the word I'm looking for? Organisation, for want of a better word. For 12 years, right-wing fascism had been right across the continent. So people naturally started to lean to the left. That included Britain, who ousted Churchill and what have you, and voted in its first a Labour government. The French looked like they were going to go towards a communist, or certainly to communist government, or certainly to the left. Italy was the same. Greece, again, was the same. And in Greece, the British Army was trying to quell a communist uprising. But we just couldn't afford it. And in the end, and Turkey also looked a bit dodgy as well down that way. So in the end, the British government spoke to Americans and said, look, we just can't afford this. We're going to have to pull out and let Greece certainly move to either a communist government or not. It'll be up to those people. Well, that alarmed Truman somewhat. And he came out with he had a series of speeches and doctrine that was pushed out, known as the Truman Doctrine. And this was to stop or inhibit the spread of communism within any given state around the world, if at all possible, to try and stop the spread of the red stain, as they were known. Anyway, so as I said before, one of the perfect breeding grounds for communism is a suppressed population, should we say, poverty-ridden, lack of food, and Central Europe was perfect for that. So the European Economic Recovery Plan was born, known as the Marshall Plan, more so. Well, the Marshall Plan was interesting because basically what it said was any country in the world could come and ask the Americans for help, and the American government would supply them basically what they wanted. So this wasn't a cash handout, and this is the very clever thing about it. So Britain, for instance, needed tractors because we still needed to produce more food. So we asked for, a vast amount of tractors, which were built in America and shipped to Britain. So the American government then paid American manufacturers to produce the goods, which were then shipped into the UK and many other Western-leaning countries, supporting specifically their agriculture and rebuilding. It was also offered to the Eastern Bloc, so any country that was currently under Soviet administration could also ask for help. The Czechoslovaks and the Polish both expressed a wish, but Stalin unfortunately declined on their behalf, saying that there was no need for that. So basically, he in the countries where the Soviet Union basically held sway, political organizations were encouraged that were leaning to the left as opposed to the right, whereas in true capitalist fashion, those that lent to the West were rewarded. But what's interesting are the two figures that we have there. We've got $1.448 million that was expended on Germany in aid. The second figure, just over $3,000 million, or 3 trillion, I don't know, is that what it is? Anyway, that was given to the UK. So that tells us how much of a mess we were in economically at the end of the Second World War. As victors, we needed twice as much as Germany to rebuild, and we hadn't seen half of the devastation that country had. Now, that is a big debate in itself, but let's just say that doesn't help when these sort of aid packages don't help when you're asking on behalf of an empire, a crumbling empire at this point, and an empire that had pretty much gone by the 1960s. But that is the reason that figure is so big, because we actually had to cover off and pay debts with other countries around the world, or certainly within our empire. So, as we've said, quite an interesting collection of things moving in and around the country. Coffee being one. That was, in fact, I think most of the world ran on coffee towards the end of all this, with the Marshall Plan. Well, with not a great idea as to what was going to happen in 1945, by 1947-48, other moves were afoot within Germany proper. Basically, those of you in England, or in Britain, I should say, will be familiar with rationing, which carried on until 1953 or thereabouts, including the rationing of bread, which is not something that had been rationed during the war, although I believe it was fairly unpalatable, cardboardy type of bread that was available, the Unity loaf, I believe, and you were encouraged to leave it go stale for a day because people wouldn't eat as much of it when it was stale. But anyway, we were giving so much aid to our to Germany by this time, and other parts of the world, I should say, that basic rationing was retained in the UK well beyond the war as a factor. One thing we should do is we should aim to reunify, was the call. So the 4 zones became 2 in the end, which was known as a buy zone, which doesn't help with the third bit, which was the French pieces as well, that one piece did come back into Germany, with a capital at Bonn. So some of you may remember West Germany. The capital of West Germany was Bonn, up until 1990 or thereabouts, and it created Western Germany. So Western Germany meant that the Allies had made a commitment to support that blue section that you can see on the map there of the country, leaving the Soviets to deal with the right-hand side. Now, the biggest problem with this is that the Soviets, under Stalin, of course, actually wanted reunification of the whole of Germany as quickly as possible. Now, the reason for that was that they could spread the communist message in amongst all the chaos that they'd already caused by filling the blue area with another 26 million people, and then forcing other nations around the world to feed them, basically. The idea was that it would be such an awful situation that the Soviets, with the agriculture, don't forget, over their side, will be able to say, look, if we run this country, it will be back on its feet. So when Western Germany was formed, or the buy zone, then Western Germany was formed, this did not please the Soviets one little bit, because it was a big fly in the ointment of their idea of taking the whole of Germany as a communist state, or to communism. Now, as I've said, one of the problems with Berlin was that it was nicely 100 miles or so inside the Soviet zone. So the Soviets, of course, within Berlin itself, were not supplying food to those areas administered by the British, the French, and the Americans. So they had to take food in, and anything else that was needed for the rebuild effort and everything else. So 3 road links had been agreed to stay open at the end of the Second World War. Rail links were also available once they'd been repaired, and canals were another way of moving equipment and food into the city. And this was a substantial movement of equipment, men, women, everything else that you could think of, backwards and forwards every day. Now, as the buy zone took bite, the Soviets instructed checkpoint guards at the border and such like of the east and west zones, as east and west Germany, sorry, to have problems with paperwork, should we say. Drivers don't have the correct dockets. They changed permits overnight so that when the following day lots of equipment turned up or food turned up, it had to be turned away and basically what they said was, we're just going to make it a little bit more difficult. We feel that the border that has been imposed between the western zones and the eastern zone is the Allies' fault, so they should pay and have some problems trying to transit it. It's not our fault that you've decided you're going to create your own Germany. And so it looked like there was going to be a bit of a problem over Berlin in April 1948. And certainly there was. Politically, the government the Allied government that was running Berlin, the Kommandantur collapsed, and or partially collapsed, I should say, and food and such like was not allowed in. So somebody came up with a bright idea. We can still move some equipment in, because in amongst our blockades so this isn't the blockade as such, but in amongst the restrictions to get food into the city, and food did get in slowly, but at an extremely reduced rate. When we agreed with roads, rails and canal links, somebody said, well, should we not have 3 air corridors as well? And so all concerned were, yeah, I suppose we could do that. So as an actual afterthought, air corridors were placed from the Western Germany into what became Eastern Germany, and certainly to Berlin. And it's a good job they did, because the little lift, as it was, demonstrated the effectiveness of air travel or air cargo. Right, brilliant. Okay, so little lift flew Dakotas. You see some Dakotas there, top left, from Frankfurt into Berlin and round and back again. Not a massive amount of tonnage. Each one of those aircraft only carries 3 tons. Sounds a lot, but 3 tons of coal is not a lot, is it really? At the end of the day, for those of you that remember that. So there was no real opportunity to completely supply the city by air, but it complemented what the restrictions were causing. So it filled the gap, if you like, between when trucks couldn't get over the border for whatever permit reason. Air cargo did manage to get some of those supplies in. It was not a safe undertaking, as you probably see in the bottom right there on the 5th of April. A BEA, sorry, British European Airways Viking was buzzed by a Yak fighter in the air corridor. Unfortunately, the Yak pilot misjudged what he was doing and took the tail off the Viking. So the Viking crashed with killing all on board. In the Soviet sector, and the Yak crashed in the British sector. But this could have been seen as a bit of an act of war, maybe, but it was basically blamed on the Yak pilot in the end, being foolhardy. But it demonstrated something. The little lift showed that aircraft could indeed take material into the city, and it could be fairly unopposed, because there is only one way to stop an airlift or an aircraft, and that's to bring it down. If you own the airfield at both ends, then you're almost impervious. And that was what sat in the back of the minds of the Allied forces, certainly the Americans and the British, who were still building the Western buy zone and looking at ways of complementing the food pile in the city. Right. So what finalised East and West Germany really was the introduction of a new currency. So on the 20th of June 1948, the Americans introduced the Deutsche Mark. So there's one, lad. Yeah. This replaced the old Reichsmark and was usable across the whole of the Western zone. But of course, some areas in Berlin were also under Western authority. So a further note was provided for that, and you can possibly see the B stamp in the middle of that note. That note there was only valid in Berlin itself. There was supposed to be no swapping of notes from one place to the other for inflation and all that sort of thing, and that was basically what that was. But the bottom line is that when on the 20th of June 1948 the Allies issued this note and closed down the old monetary system, the Soviets realized that they were never going to reunify Germany in the short term. And so not 4 days later, the Soviets introduced their own note, which is the Ostmark, which is the East Mark, as some of you know. And some of you may be familiar with those, the Deutsche Mark, it's all euro now, isn't it? But so that was it. That was the partition of Germany fixed in mid 1948. Well, of course, the Soviets were not too happy about that and decided that they wanted the Allied stain, which is the blob in Berlin, cleared and just turned over to them.
Thank you for watching part 2 of this heritage talk on the Berlin Airlift 10 tons for Tempelhof.